Good evening, and welcome to tonight's presentation, From the Quarries, an archive of Masonic lore. This presentation delves into the intriguing history of Freemasonry during the tumultuous era of the Napoleonic Wars, with a focus on the unique role Masons played as prisoners of war. It explores the background to French Freemasonry during the late 18th century, the vexed question of whether Bonaparte himself was a Mason, and finishes with how approximately 200,000 members of the French army, including Freemasons, were captured and incarcerated in England. Despite the harsh conditions, these Masonic prisoners demonstrated remarkable resilience and brotherhood, establishing lodges even within the confines of prison ships and land prisons. The presentation highlights how these lodges functioned as a testament to the Masonic values of fraternity and mutual support, shedding light on a little-known aspect of Masonic history during one of modern Europe's defining periods. Freemasonry in France during the Napoleonic period. Freemasonry in France experienced significant transformation during the reign of Napoleon Bonaparte, a period marked by a political upheaval and societal reformation. Freemasonry played a unique role in the socio-political landscape of France from the late 18th to the early 19th centuries. The origins of French Freemasonry date back to the early 18th century, with the first Grand Lodge established in 1728. Freemasonry quickly spread and became popular among the French elites and intellectuals, who were attracted to its Enlightenment ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, values that resonated deeply in a society on the cusp of revolution. During the French Revolution, Freemasons were at the forefront, with many members actively participating in revolutionary activities. Notably, the revolutionary slogan, "Liberty, Equality, Fraternity," was deeply rooted in Masonic philosophy. Freemasons were also prominent in revolutionary activities, playing significant roles in both the political and ideological transformations of the era. The activities of several historical figures substantiate the involvement of Freemasons in the Revolution. 1. Voltaire. One of the most famous intellectuals associated with the Enlightenment and Freemasonry, Voltaire was initiated into Freemasonry shortly before his death in 1778. Although he did not participate in the Revolution directly, his writings and ideas, which were steeped in Enlightenment principles, greatly influenced the revolutionary leaders. Many of those who led the revolution were inspired by his advocacy for civil liberties, justice, and the separation of church and state. The Marquis de Lafayette. Perhaps one of the most direct examples of a Freemason involved in the revolution is the Marquis de Lafayette. A key figure in both the American and French revolutions, Lafayette was a member of the Masonic lodge Confines Social. He played a crucial role in the early stages of the French Revolution, helping to draft the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen in 1789, which was heavily influenced by Masonic principles of equality and fraternity. Georges Danton. A leading figure in the early days of the French Revolution, Danton is believed to have been a Freemason, although the documentation here is less direct. His role as a member of the Cordeliers Club, a revolutionary group, and his leadership during the Reign of Terror highlight the active participation of Freemasons in revolutionary events. Camille Desmoulins, a journalist and politician who played a significant role in the Revolution. Desmoulins was also a Freemason. He is best known for his role in the storming of the Bastille, and for his fiery speeches and writings, which incited the Parisian populace to revolutionary action. Joseph Ignace Guillotin. Although Guillotin is often remembered for the guillotine, his role as a Freemason and a revolutionary is notable. He was a member of the French Assembly and advocated for humane methods of capital punishment, which is ironic given that the guillotine became a symbol of the Reign of Terror. Jacques-Pierre Brissot. A leading figure in the Girondist faction, Brissot was a prominent journalist and a member of the Legislative Assembly. His political platform included calls for the end of the monarchy and the establishment of a republic. Brissot was known to be a Freemason, and his ideals of liberty and democratic reform were reflective of Masonic principles. Louis-Philippe II, Duke of Orleans, also known as Philippe Égalité. A cousin of King Louis XVI, Louis-Philippe was initially supportive of the revolution and adopted the name Philippe Égalité to reflect his support for revolutionary ideals. He was a member of the Jacobin Club and a Freemason, using his position to further the revolutionary cause. However, his story ended tragically when he voted for the execution of the king and was later guillotined during the Reign of Terror. Antoine Barnave. A member of the Assembly and a leading constitutional monarchist, Barnave played a significant role in the early years of the Revolution. He was involved in Freemasonry and sought to steer France towards a constitutional monarchy rather than a complete overthrow of the royal institution. His efforts ultimately failed, and he fell out of favour, eventually being executed during the Reign of Terror. Claude Fauchet. A constitutional bishop and a revolutionary, Fauchet was known for his radical views and support for the poor and dispossessed. His involvement in Freemasonry is noted for its influence on his egalitarian and philanthropic ideals. Fauchet was active in promoting the revolutionary government's policies before he was arrested and executed by guillotine. However, the revolution saw a split within Masonic ranks, with some lodges supporting the radical changes while others were more conservative, fearing the chaos and violence associated with the period. Napoleon Bonaparte's rise to power marked a new phase for Freemasonry in France. Initially, Napoleon viewed Freemasonry with suspicion, associating it with the liberal and revolutionary ideals that had challenged his authority. However, recognizing the influence and the organized network of the Masons, Napoleon decided to co-opt rather than combat the organization. His regime sought to control Freemasonry to harness its power for consolidating his rule. Under Napoleon, Freemasonry underwent significant reorganization. In 1804, with his encouragement, the Grand Orient of France, the leading Masonic body in the country, re-established itself formally after a period of inactivity during the Revolution. This re-establishment was marked by the Grand Orient declaring its loyalty to Napoleon and his government. Napoleon's brothers, Joseph and Lucien, as well as many of his marshals and officials, were Freemasons, which helped integrate Masonic activity into the state apparatus. Napoleon used Freemasonry as a tool of governance and diplomacy. Lodges often served as places where influential figures could meet and discuss matters of state in a confidential setting. This integration helped Napoleon consolidate his power by creating a loyal base within France's influential classes. Moreover, Freemasonry's hierarchical and ritualistic structure mirrored the centralized authoritarian structure Napoleon was establishing in France. The reorganization of Freemasonry under Napoleon also reflected his broader policy of control over religious and societal institutions. By placing Freemasonry under the oversight of the state, Napoleon could ensure that it would not serve as a center of opposition to his regime. The Imperial Catechism of 1806, which dictated the religious policy of the state, is one example of this broader strategy, placing the Church and other institutions under state control or influence, including Masonic lodges. Despite this integration, the relationship between Napoleon and Freemasonry was complex and sometimes strained. The Masonic emphasis on individual liberty and ethical universalism occasionally clashed with Napoleon's autocratic tendencies and the militaristic expansion of his empire. After his fall in 1815, Freemasonry in France faced suppression during the reactionary Bourbon Restoration, which viewed it as a relic of Napoleonic and revolutionary excess. Was Napoleon a Freemason? The question of whether Napoleon Bonaparte himself was a Freemason has been a subject of debate among historians and Masonic scholars. This controversy stems from a lack of definitive documentary evidence confirming his membership, contrasting with the numerous accounts and circumstantial evidence suggesting that he indeed had connections to Freemasonry. Evidence of potential involvement. 1. Family ties. Napoleon's family had clear Masonic connections. His brothers Joseph and Lucien Bonaparte were known Freemasons. Joseph was particularly active in Masonic circles, and his involvement might suggest a familial acceptance or even participation in Masonic activities which indirectly ties Napoleon to Freemasonry. 2. Support of Masonic institutions. During his reign, Napoleon showed substantial support for Masonic institutions. He allowed the re-establishment of the Grand Orient of France and appointed several high-ranking Masons to prominent political and military positions. For example, Jean-Jacques Régis de Cambaceres, who was the Arch-Chancellor of the Empire, was a known Freemason and played a significant role in the Napoleonic Code's development. His Masonic connections were reviewed as beneficial in administering and reforming the state. This patronage has been interpreted by some as evidence of possible membership or at least a favourable disposition towards Freemasonry on the part of Napoleon. Under his regime, Masonic lodges were allowed to meet with less interference compared with other secret societies. These meetings provided venues where influential individuals could gather, which potentially benefited Napoleon by creating a loyal cadre of supporters within France's elite. 3. Masonic policies. Napoleon's policies towards Freemasonry were supportive compared to other societies, which he suppressed. His approach to managing Freemasonry, by controlling and using it for his political ends, mirrors the strategy he used with other institutions, suggesting a pragmatic rather than ideological engagement with the craft. This was demonstrated through comparative tolerance. While other societies and groups faced suppression, Freemasonry experienced relative tolerance and was allowed to flourish. This selective support can be contrasted with his crackdown on societies like the Illuminati and the Jacobins, which were seen as direct threats to his power. Also, Napoleon's utilization of Freemasonry can be seen as strategic. By including members of the military and the bureaucracy, he was able to integrate and ensure loyalty and provide a controlled environment where discussions and policies could be influenced subtly. Additionally, the legal status granted to Freemasonry under Napoleon helped it to become a stable and influential institution within French society. By embedding Freemasonry within the societal framework, Napoleon could leverage its hierarchical and loyal structure to reinforce his regime. There are, however, many arguments against Napoleon's being a member of the craft. 1. Lack of direct evidence. There are no surviving records or first-hand accounts that definitively state that Napoleon was initiated into Freemasonry, Unlike his brothers, Napoleon's direct involvement in Masonic rituals or lodge meetings is not documented. 2. Political utilitarianism. Napoleon's interactions with Freemasonry might be seen as purely political, aimed at controlling an influential organization rather than participating out of personal conviction or a belief in Masonic principles. And 3. Masonic writings and testimonies. Some Masonic writings and testimonies from prominent Freemasons during and after his time do not list him as a member. This absence can easily be interpreted as evidence against his membership, considering the comprehensive records kept on other notable figures. Overall, then, the question of Napoleon's membership in Freemasonry may never be conclusively answered, due to the historical gaps and the ambiguous records which have been maintained. The evidence suggests that while Napoleon was not averse to using Freemasonry for his political ends, and had close familial and political ties to the organization, he may not have been a Freemason himself. Napoleonic Masons as prisoners of war. The world of 150 to 200 years ago was a changing and disturbed world. Steam power was replacing the horse on land and the sail at sea, just as the idea of political and religious liberty had commenced to wipe out serfdom and bigotry in civilized lands. The United States was proving its right to independence and self-determination, and even then was preparing for the great internecine struggle of the Civil War. It was an age of expanding horizons and increasing vision, of strident revolutions, mighty nations, and even mightier conflicts. It was also the time of a remarkable demonstration of Masonic diligence and fraternal toleration to an unheard-of degree. During the 7 Years' War and the Napoleonic Wars, roughly between 1740 and 1814, approximately 200,000 members of the French army were taken prisoner and held in captivity in England. Not all of these prisoners were French, although they were members of the French army. How many Poles, Germans, Italians, and Spaniards there were in this group cannot be said, but there must have been a considerable number. As a guide, one might use the 500,000 men that Napoleon led into Russia in the abortive campaign of 1812. Only 200,000 of these soldiers were French. In view of this, the Masonic diligence they displayed takes on an interesting international tinge. About 50,000 of the war captives were held in Britain in 8 principal land prisons. The rest were incarcerated in prison ships that were literally floating coffins. The officers among the ship-bound prisoners were considered in a category separate from the others. Those who would give their parole were allowed to live in one of the designated parole towns. They received a weekly allowance from the British government of a half-guinea. This allowance, it should be understood, was given only to those who would give their parole. The rest got nothing. Bad food, rags for clothing, pestilence, and chains. No one ever took the pains to record just how many of the prisoners were Masons, but there must have been a great many and of considerable dedication. In the 8 land prisons, they established 5 lodges. In the 50 parole towns, 32 lodges. And, impossible as it may be to conceive, in the 51 prison hulks, where anything like a normal life was virtually, if not completely impossible, there were 6 lodges established. It should be understood that these were not casual or occasional meetings of men belonging to the craft, but, within the limitations of time and facilities, properly established bodies, although generally without warrants. They conducted regular stated meetings with a full list of officers and a code of bylaws. They kept accurate and complete minutes of their meetings, many of which are preserved to this day. That this was not only condoned, but even encouraged by British brethren, is attested by many recorded facts. At least 4 of these lodges, in Ashby, Chesterfield, Leek, and Northampton, applied for and received permits from the acting Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of England, although they did their work in association with the Grand Orient of France. Rites practiced generally were the Rite Française ou Moderne, adopted by the Grand Orient of France in 1786. It featured 7 degrees, the first 3 the same as those we practice today, the upper 4 in ascending order being Elect, Scotch Master, Knight of the East, and Rose Croix. To add variety to the picture, some of the certificates given by these lodges were signed in the 11th degree of the Adoniramite rite. That the craft could even think of a lodge meeting under the stultifying conditions of the prison ships is almost incredible, but they did. In fact, one brother left a description of a lodge meeting he visited on one of the hulks, the Guildford, anchored in Portsmouth Harbour. This visiting brother was named Lardier. He visited this meeting under the sponsorship of 2 other brothers, whom he refers to as the Children of the True Light. They traversed the whole length of a lower deck without illumination. Then they reached a trapdoor, which was raised by another brother, so they might descend a short, rotten ladder to a still lower and still darker deck. In this situation, he was led through complete darkness by sure hands, until they were confronted by a man who demanded the password, signs, and grips. Having satisfactorily met this challenge, they crawled through a small door into a cramped room where the ceiling was so low that they could not stand erect. Illumination of the hall was by means of a candle mounted in an old bottle. Only the master was provided with a seat, and this was a dilapidated bench from which one leg was broken. The rest of the brethren sat on the floor. Here the visitor saw a candidate put through one of the degrees. He remarked,
"Physical examination and much of the ritual were impossible because of the cramped quarters, but the candidate was rigorously tested from the moral viewpoint, especially in matter of patriotism."
The master's speech, which was also a prayer, went,
"Thy children cannot close these labours without expressing their grief and rendering homage to thee. My heart is not captive, it is still free and faithful. It lifts itself out of this place of bondage and speeds to the land that gave it birth. May the glory of thy triumphs never fade. May the hero who guides thy chosen be able to add the last and only jewel which is wanting in thy crown, by utterly destroying that odious rival which dares to contend with thee for mastery of the world."
These words are living proof of the indestructible spirit of the faithful craftsmen who met in that dark room in the belly of the prison ship. This remarkable meeting closed with a voluntary offering for the relief of others more distressed than themselves. What can men give who have nothing for themselves? No one knows, but give they did, and records amply show that the generosity of these half-starved, half-clothed shadows of what were once men gave not only for needy brethren, but for all prisoners whose need was greater than theirs. Was there ever a more perfect ashlar for that symbolic temple? Where did they get anything to give? Again, no one can say, but it is known that they made and sold art trinkets of magnificent craftsmanship. This undoubtedly was part of their source of income. Truly marvellous contrived medallions constructed by these unfortunate brothers are still on display in the great Freemasons' Hall off Drury Lane in London. 44 certificates issued by these lodges have been discovered. These beautifully lettered documents, with a seal of wax from specially cut dies enclosed in a tin box, ribboned, as documents of the day often were, are each a work of art in itself. The wonder is not that they spent the time and effort to make them so notable, but that the wretched prisoners on the comfortless and pestilential prison hulks were able to procure the necessary items for their fabrication. Considering the words of the Guildford master quoted earlier, and in view of the centuries of bitter French-English rivalry and war, it would seem unlikely that even Masonry could cross so insurmountable a barrier. But it did. It is reported that a brother Burns, who was magistrate and master of the British Lodge at Montrose, actually released French prisoners from jail as a fraternal gesture. The minutes of many British lodges show that French parolees were frequently received as welcome visitors, and, in many cases, became joining members. As has been noted earlier, at least 4 lodges among French prisoners were sanctioned by English Grand Lodge warrants. Most of the French prisoners of war lodges restricted themselves to French members, but in at least 3 lodges, Abergavenny, Launceston and Wincanton, Englishmen applied for membership and were accepted and initiated. An interesting sidelight occurs through the fact that under French Masonic rules, 7 Master Masons in a town where there was no lodge, or 21 in a town where a lodge already existed, could hold a meeting and elect officers. Thus, at Peebles in 1811, French prisoners established and operated a lodge. The local British lodge made no objection to this until it was discovered that the prisoners' lodge was initiating new members. They objected to the Grand Lodge of England on the grounds that their own properly constituted lodge was adequate to the occasion. The Grand Lodge agreed, but the prisoner Masons, operating under their own French rules, disagreed. Records of this disagreement are to be found in several references, but only one makes further comment, and he notes, rather cryptically, that there is no record that the prisoners' Masonic work was discontinued. To complete the picture, it is not only necessary, but fitting, to point out that during this same period of time, approximately 25,000 English soldiers were taken prisoner by the French. Once again, it is impossible to say how many of these men were Masons. However, in a detachment of the British 9th Regiment of Foot that was captured and confined, there was a regularly constituted travelling military lodge, number 183 Ancients. This lodge met regularly in prison in the fortress of Valenciennes until 1814. The minutes of its meetings have been preserved. Today, as we sit in our comfortable halls with all the treasured implements of our moral labours about us, it is difficult to conceive of the difficulties under which our imprisoned brethren struggled to maintain and demonstrate their fraternal fidelity, but not at all difficult to understand. Masonry, to them, was far more than a fraternal link. It was a vital and living key to continued existence. As a final note, it should not be thought that this small section of history is merely a record in the archives, or, for that matter, only another demonstration of the way Masonry raises a man above himself. It is still a subject for discussion and comment. As late as 1913, a pamphlet was published in Paris accusing French Freemasons of assisting their imprisoned British brethren to escape. At this late date, firm proof for or against this assertion is impossible to find. However, from the evidence at hand, it would appear quite likely that the accusation is gloriously and wonderfully true. For a deep dive into the history, philosophy, and traditions of Freemasonry, subscribe to From the Quarries. You will find hundreds of lectures, presentations, shorts, and other Masonic works written by Freemasons for Freemasons. Visit FromTheQuarries.com or YouTube at From the Quarries.